It's Friday, January 10th. Welcome to This Week in Impact, where we bring you some of the most interesting impact investing and sustainable finance stories of the week. I'm Brian Walsh, and I'm joined by ImpactAlpha's Jessica Pothering, who's in for David Bank. It's our first episode of 2025, and today we'll be discussing this month's list of impact-oriented funds recently in the market raising capital, with glimmers of hope for impact fund managers shining through the fundraising fog. Plus, how catalytic capital is spurring ecosystem regeneration in Brazil. And finally, how investors are betting on drones to lift agricultural productivity and women's livelihoods in India. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Hi, Jessica. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Brian. It's great to be here. I'm excited to get to be the first one on the podcast this year.
Yeah, it's great to have you back on the This Week in Impact podcast. Great to have you in while David is away this week. So first up, let's talk about the fundraising environment for impact-oriented fund managers. Now, Jessica, you curate our monthly list of funds that are recently in the market raising capital. What stood out for you in the January edition, which we published this week?
That's right, Brian. We've been publishing the list for a little over 2 years now. It's kind of hard to believe. And as we were heading into 2025, I was really curious because, I've just been hearing all year about what a terrible fundraising environment it was in 2024. I just wanted to take a look back at what we'd covered, at least in the list for the year 2024, and just go back to some of those fund managers and get their takeaways from how in fact their progress was last year, and then just what they're looking ahead to for this year and whether or not they think things are going to improve. And I will say, I felt optimistic that they all seem to be quite cautiously optimistic that things will get better, this year.
And so why are you optimistic?
I think the sort of takeaway that I had for this was actually it can only get better. Andy Cooper from Leapfrog Investments, they closed their fourth fund late last year, shy of their original $1 billion target. And he summarized it as, probably the hardest fundraising environment of the 21st century so far. So, and I figured if they're in their fourth fund and they're raising quite a big fund and they're having a hard time, this must be really difficult for first-time fund managers. So, I think the feeling was it can only get better.
So that's the optimistic take that that we've been in a dry fundraising period, but maybe the return of M&A activity that's fueling some exits might also free up some capital that can be invested in the new funds.
Yeah, one of the fund managers I spoke with, Sarah Applebaum from Pangea Ventures, cited that she was hopeful that M&A activity was going to resume this year, and that would provide some liquidity to LPs to be able to invest in new funds. And actually, that sort of tracked with a trend that my colleague Amy Cortez spotlighted in her summary of climate tech investing. That was based off of a report that Sightline Climate just published about climate tech investing trends last year. And the climate tech side, actually, M&A was a rare bright spot in 2024. And so I think there's a bit of dovetailing on the fund side too, that fund managers are also hopeful that there will be more liquidity, and that's why some of the fundraising activity will resume this year.
And so liquidity begets more liquidity. So when the GPs have exits, then the LPs then have more money to put back into other GPs.
That's right. And one of the things that stood out, actually, we had another report that came out last year, in the last quarter of last year, from Collar Capital, that said, actually, one of the big focus areas for bigger investors is finding new fund managers to invest in. I think they cited something like 86% of the LPs that they interviewed intend to invest in a new manager either this year or next year, and specifically because they're really just looking at ways to diversify their portfolios and tap some overlooked investment opportunities that aren't present in their portfolios yet.
This problem of first-time fund managers is the classic chicken and egg situation where it's really hard to raise money for your first fund without a track record, but you can't get a track record unless you are able to successfully raise for your first fund. So how are Impact LPs trying to address that issue of first-time fund managers and growing that pipeline?
Right. I mean, I think in the broader LP side of things, I mean, it's one thing to say what you intend to do, and it's another thing to do it. So we'll see if that actually does pan out. What I've seen, well, at least on the GP side, when I was going through and analyzing the funds that we profiled last year on the list, at least 40%, I think actually the number of that is probably much higher, but at least 40% reported being catalytic or blended finance funds that are leveraging some sort of catalytic mechanism. And I think, that's showing up really as a key way to de-risk and prove out some of these new theses and a way to bring on LPs that have never seen these ideas before.
That focus on first-time fund managers that you've done, I think, is one of the highlights, if you will, of the list that you put together every month. Is you're not just looking at the common names that people already know, but trying to shine a light on those that perhaps need a little bit of a boost and more visibility.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, every month when I write the list, I always feel like the most immediate thing that stands out to me is, the number of first-time fund managers that we're seeing. And so it was really validating to go back and look at a year's worth of data from the list and see that. So we profiled 67 funds last year, and 29 of them were actually run by first-time fund managers. And I think oftentimes we think of first-time fund managers as starting with these really small funds, like $10 million or $20 million or whatever. But actually they really ranged across the spectrum. There was one that was 150 million, another one that was over 500 million. And so it really just depends on the strategy that you're pursuing, right? And the volume of capital that's needed for that strategy, not necessarily, that you have to start with something small just because it's the first time you're doing it.
All right. Well, you can read Jessica's full list of impact-oriented funds recently in the market raising capital on ImpactAlpha.com, and we'll also have a link in our show notes. But let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll discuss how catalytic capital is spurring ecosystem regeneration in Brazil. In Brazil, catalytic capital in the form of development finance and philanthropic funds has been instrumental in advancing ecosystem regeneration efforts. That's according to a guest post this week by Dario Parziella, Managing Director of Tonic. He points out that in Brazil, land use and agriculture account for 75% of the country's greenhouse gas emissions. So Jessica, to start us off, what do we mean by ecosystem regeneration? Yeah,
so when we're talking about ecosystem restoration, we're literally talking about restoring soil health and land back to a healthier state. That's better for biodiversity. That's better for farmers, growing conditions, and just more resilient, which improves the overall community resilience, but also climate resilience.
So, what does it mean to invest in ecosystem regeneration?
Well, at the land level, you're talking about working with land stewards, landowners, farmers, in many cases, farming communities, indigenous communities. And so it's interesting because, we're using some new terminology here as climate's showing up more on people's radar, but financing farmers has always been a key pillar of the impact sector. And now, rather than just looking at how to get farmers the financial and technological tools that they need to improve their incomes and be more resilient, we're also looking at this from a climate perspective. And how do we restore soil health? Because we realize that, that makes not only the ecological ecosystems better prepared and more resilient to climate change, but it also supports the communities that are living off of those resources.
Exactly. A smallholder farmer that Dario quoted in the piece is that the forest is worth more standing than lying down, but we need support. If my child is starving and I need to cut down a tree, I will, but I don't want to. If I have resources and support, I can do both, take care of the forest and have income to take care of my family. So it sounds like this is not just a economic sustainability play, but it's also a climate play.
Yeah, very much. And it's increasingly, I think, on impact investors' radar. But when you're talking about working with these more remote communities, often they're not as well connected. They're working on smaller farms. They're working with smaller plots of land. They're lower income and, have fewer resources themselves to work with. And so uh, when you're an investor, that seems very risky to you because it often feels very unknown, right? So at least as long as I've been covering the impact space, most investments and funds that are focusing on smallholder agriculture, and now increasingly the ones that are pairing that with land regeneration, really rely heavily on catalytic and blended finance in order to get their funds off the ground.
Right, because the investments are so risky and they need to make the credit available to these smallholder farmers more affordable, and that therefore requires, that, as you said, philanthropic and development finance funds in the form of catalytic financing to help attract the more commercial capital to deploy in these areas.
Right. Well, at least the perception of them is that they're more risky, right?
That's true. And so much is in the perception when we're talking about credit risks. So can you expand on how catalytic capital differs from traditional investments in its ability to drive systemic change?
Sure. I mean, these are investments that are accepting a disproportionate amount of risk, or taking concessionary returns, in order to help prove out a model or bring in other forms of financing. And so the case in this study, from Dario at Tonic, is Fama Recapital, and a bioeconomy fund that they've raised in Brazil that's focused on smallholder farmers, and indigenous communities, and helping them finance the transition to more sustainable land use activities. But we've seen this show up in other funds as well. There's MCE Social Capital that's largely focusing on smallholder farmers in Africa. There's Root Capital that works with smallholder farmers all over Latin America, and they're also leveraging catalytic capital in order to get money into these communities.
Sometimes catalytic capital is likened to training wheels on a bike, and that they just need those training wheels to help the investment get off on its own, and then you can take them off, and then the investment is able to kind of attract and maintain commercial capital. And sometimes catalytic capital is seen as permanent training wheels in a way that they always will need that kind of that support to help make these investments more sustainable and more attractive to commercial investors. So which is the model here? Is this kind of temporary training wheels, or is it ongoing support?
I think in the broader natural capital space, you'll see those quote unquote catalytic training wheels come off. This is an area that's garnering a lot more attention, even from larger institutional investors. I feel like natural resources financing was a big topic at the GIN summit last October in Amsterdam, and a lot of that was about focus on sustainable timber and farmland management, and that's like much more on the institutional side. When you're talking about going down deep into local communities, I think that type of concessional or risk buffering financing is going to be needed for quite a long time yet. Because you are talking about much smaller ticket sizes that aren't going to be moving large amounts of money, and oftentimes technical assistance to support those communities in the types of technology transition or technique transition. Oftentimes that's needed, and that usually has to be grant funded. So it really will be on a case by case basis. But I think especially at the smallholder farming level, for some time yet, there's going to be quite a lot of this type of capital that's needed. And I think that's the good thing actually about these types of case studies is just it's important for us to go deep on some of these models and how they're working, so that investors can learn and this can be replicated in other places. One of the fund managers I spoke to actually for the list, from Amazonia Impact Ventures, they're based in the UK, but they work with indigenous and land stewarding communities in the Amazon to do the similar kinds of work to what Fama Recapital is doing. they've talked about how they still feel like there's really a steep learning curve around blended finance and catalytic mechanisms in the investor community. And so, so it just highlights the point that this will probably be needed for some time, and that these case studies are really invaluable to the field.
And as I understand, Jessica, this case study is just the first in a series. Tell us more about that.
Yes, Tonic is going to be featuring a number of their case studies on catalytic capital transitions on ImpactAlpha. I mean, they have a pretty huge database of more than 200 of these types of deals, and so it'll give folks a chance to go deeper and learn about how catalytic capital is playing out in different sectors and geographies and contexts.
That's great. Well, you can read Dario's piece on ImpactAlpha.com. We'll have a link to it in our show notes. But for right now, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll take a look at how investors are betting on drones to lift agricultural productivity and women's livelihoods in India. In India, investors are increasingly supporting the use of drones to enhance agricultural productivity and improve women's livelihoods. As Shefali Anand reported this week, drones offer efficient solutions for tasks like crop monitoring, pesticide spraying, and data collection, which can lead to higher yields and reduced labor. So, Jessica, tell us more about this recent trend.
This was an interesting story when Shefali is based in Delhi, and when she pitched the story to me, I thought, oh, that's interesting, because agricultural drones, they were really exciting in the United States in the ag tech venture space, probably 6-7 years ago. And then that kind of petered out because they didn't really realize their potential for a variety of reasons, at least those early iterations of them. And so it was really interesting to see this trend cropping up in India. And there's a couple of things at play here. One is they're really being supported by some policy initiatives from the Indian government. And two, just the farming sector in India is much better suited for drone use, actually, than large commercial farms in places like the United States or Australia.
What's behind this policy momentum that's supporting the drone industry in India?
There's a few different policies at play. I think the current government in India, one, just wants to put India out there in the world as a hotspot for drone manufacturing, because they think, in a number of different contexts, there's increasing drone adoption, if not in the agriculture sector, but, in whether it's defense, whether it's, search and rescue, that's being picked up in other parts of the world. And so the government wants India to be seen as the place for drone manufacturing and expertise. So there's some favorable policy around domestic manufacturing of drones. And then for their rural employment and women's empowerment initiatives, they see drones as an opportunity for job creation. So they've passed a couple of different policies, one in particular called Drone Didi, that's focused on helping rural women learn how to pilot drones, buy them, and provide services to farmers in their community, using drones as for crop monitoring or for crop spraying. And so it's seen as an economic empowerment driver.
So as you said, drones didn't really take off in the U.S. agricultural sector as expected just a few years ago. But Shefali's article makes clear that there's more promise for them in India. Why is that the case?
I think the original thinking when the VC world got really excited about the drone trend in agriculture in the U.S. a few years ago was the promise for automation and mechanization in a sector that's frankly losing workforce. But then those early models of drones just ended up really not being able to do the job over large tracts of land because they couldn't hold a battery charge for as long as was needed, or they couldn't carry as large of a payload for crop spraying as was needed at the time. And so in India, actually, they're much better suited because the farm sizes are just frankly a lot smaller. You're talking about farms that are just a couple of acres in size. And so even, simpler models of drones, could work in a context like that where they're not having to cover as wide of a tract of land.
All right, well, you can read Shefali's full piece on ImpactAlpha.com, and we'll also have a link in the show notes. But that's going to do it for this episode of This Week in Impact. Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thanks a lot, Brian. It's fun.
Great to have you on the podcast, as always. And thank you all for listening. This Week in Impact is a production of Impact Alpha and part of the Impact Alpha podcast network. Smart conversations by and for impact investing professionals. For exclusive stories and insights about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join thousands of other agents of impact by subscribing. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks, as always, to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For Jessica Pothering, I'm Brian Walsh. We'll see you next week for more Impact.